Hello, everyone. So my name is Ozy Aloziem. My pronouns are she, her, and hers. I am a racial equity specialist and social work educator currently. I was the previous equity, diversity, and inclusion manager for the Denver Public Library System and left that job, I want to say April of this year. I sort of leaned more into consulting. I opened Heal Inc. LLC, which stands for Healing, Equity, Accountability, and Liberation. So I am really committed to promoting healing, equity, accountability, and liberation. And I do this by leading with integrity and nurturing connection in order to radically imagine our communities and our world. So it's an acronym that has a message built within it. I'm still working on fully launching it out. I sort of got busy in between a move out of country. But I'm really excited to be here with you all to talk about how we can move towards holistic healing in our libraries as well as in our personal lives. A little bit more about me. My full name is actually Ozima Nkechi Aloziem. I was given this name by two Nigerian immigrants, Igbos to be exact. And I don't know what you all know about West African culture, but the Igbos are one of the oldest and largest tribes in Africa and are indigenous to Southeast Nigeria, which is where all of my family outside of my immediate family currently reside and is where my ancestral homes are as well. And during the Nigerian Civil War, my family lost a lot in that fight for freedom. I'm not going to go into the politics of the Nigerian Civil War, but basically what was happening was the Igbo people, Biafra, we were wanting freedom, separation from the country of Nigeria. And so it was definitely a fight for a version or a vision of freedom that folks are willing to really live and die for. Ozima means good news, and Nkechi means God's gift from God. And Aloziem was my great-great-great-grandfather's first name. And for us Igbos, our names are really important. They provide sort of a window or insight into our culture, into what we believe, but as well as our family history. And I start by naming my origin through my name, as well as by sharing this picture of my grandmother who survived the Civil War, who cared for my father and his other siblings, who rationed the aid relief that was given from the government. She was a freedom fighter of her own sorts. And in Igbo ontology, we believe that previous generations are current and or exist or live in current generations. And so everyone in my family believes that I am in some ways reincarnation of Patricia Fanny Aloziem, who's on the screen. And so lineage is really important to me, not only because of my Igbo indigeneity, but also because of how I approach this work. I derive knowledge, as it says on the screen. I'm situated at the intersection of multiple ways of knowing. What that means is that my knowledge comes from my background as a social worker, right? My master's degree in social work, my bachelor's degree in anthropology and psychology, as well as women's and gender studies. But it's also derived from my ancestral lineage and the people that I am in community with. And I've found community in different areas. I was born and raised on the land of the Omaha people in Omaha, Nebraska. I was a visitor or have been a visitor on the lands of the Cheyenne, the Ute, and the Arapaho peoples, aka Denver, Colorado, and I've been a visitor since 2015, but I'm also currently a visitor in Mexico. I am partially based here in Mexico City, and I really enjoyed learning about the culture and trying to be respectful as I can be about my presence here. And so I always start by situating myself not only in place, but in my relationship to this work and how I approach it. And it's really grounded in ancestral connection, as well as a fundamental belief that we must be connected to ourselves, the work that we do, the people that we're doing that work with, the land that we're on, right? In order for us to really be in right relationship. So now on the screen is a question. It says, how are you? I want us to pause for a bit to just take a deep breath Maybe relax your shoulders, unclench your jaw, maybe let your tongue drop from the roof of your mouth. We move so fast, right? We're so frenzied because we're responding and we're reacting to all of the things. And I don't know that we allow ourselves to really think about how we are sometimes, because the truth is sometimes just even sitting with that can feel overwhelming, can make us feel powerless, right? If you are feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling alone, if you're feeling that things are tough and they suck, you're probably not alone in that, right? We're still dealing with the COVID-19 pandemic. We're dealing with a mental health pandemic. We're dealing against all of this oppressive legislation that's coming out to ban books, to ban bodily autonomy, to ban reproductive rights, right? As well as an ever increasing rise in racial and ethnic hate crimes. And so it's important to name that these are really trying times, that we are existing and living and trying to do our best in an immense amount of grief. And I often think about, and I often say that grief is often sending us in a direction, right? Either further into ourselves or towards one another. And our bodies, they are alive, they are responding all of the time. And the question is are we listening to our bodies and the messages that they are offering, and do we know how? Because it's tough. A lot of people I know are not okay. Like I said, I am a social work professor. I teach full-time, both master's and bachelor's students, and so many of my students are not okay. They're doing the best that they can, but they are not tending to their well-being. They're trying to manage working and juggling all these jobs and trying to stay ahead of their schoolwork, right? As well as being a caretaker. And as a social worker, I know that this can be damaging. We all deserve to care for our well-being, especially those of us with identities that have been minoritized and marginalized. We as a society are experiencing collective trauma, and that's so important to name. And the next slide, I'll very briefly cover some of the kinds of trauma. But I really want to emphasize that prioritizing our well-being is a priority right now. I know that we see buzzwords like self-care, and it can seem like an excuse to avoid systemic issues, right? But it's not. It's very connected, which is what I hope you leave this presentation really understanding, right? By tending to ourselves, we give our brains reprieve, so that we can be more present in meetings, in relationships, in decision-making. I often think about how if I'm not tending to my own emotional reality, I'm forcing the people that I'm in conversation with or working with to perform that unnecessary emotional labor. And in this economy, many of us simply just can't afford that, right? And so it's important that we are doing the work that we need to do so that we don't become work for other people. And so that's also a key takeaway from this webinar today. So the different kinds of trauma. I'm going to put on my social work professor hat on for a second. We've got acute trauma, right? This is a single instance where you're fearing for one's safety. This can look like a car accident. This can look like experiencing a natural disaster, experiencing an assault. It's this instance where you feel that your life is in jeopardy or your safety is threatened. Chronic trauma is this ongoing perceived threat to one's safety. So this is long-term, for example, long-term housing instability, childhood abuse or neglect, chronic racism, right? This ongoing threat to your well-being, to your livelihood, this perceived ongoing threat. So kind of like an accumulation of acute trauma in some ways. Complex trauma is when there is some kind of combination of both acute trauma and chronic trauma. For instance, if you have been exposed to multiple traumatic events, and then this exposure leads to long-term psychological consequences or lack of access to certain resources. And so it's when there is this ongoing perceived threat as well as this sort of acute threat in the moment. We got historic trauma, which is collective trauma that is inflicted upon a group of people based on their identity, or affiliation related to ethnicity, religious background, and nationality. A lot of my social work research right now and passion and interest is really exploring the impacts of historic trauma, right? We have sort of the negative or what have been pathologized as negative coping mechanisms that we see in response to historic trauma, which is often drug use, right? Violence in some ways, domestic abuse. We also know that historic trauma can lead to some other more positive outcomes, right? A deepened sense of culture or different sort of artifacts that preserve and honor the culture. And so we explore historic trauma to understand how it has impacted groups of people, how it's passed on through generation, and how it's both what happened in the past and what is currently happening. And so you can think about groups such as Native Americans, Jewish folks, right, descendants of the enslaved. All of these groups of people have experienced historic trauma. Intergenerational trauma is sort of linked to historic trauma, but it's different. It is when there is a trauma that happens in a community or in a family that gets passed on by those who directly experience that trauma to future generations. So it's a trauma that is affecting a particular community or individual family unit. And so these last two, there's still sort of emergent research looking at how this trauma is passed on, but some of that research shows that you can see markers of that in the DNA of descendants. We see elevated instances of depression as well as anxiety in comparison to groups who don't have direct connections to these traumatic events. I promise I'm going to stop talking about trauma in a second. The other, I think, really important kind of trauma to lift up that is also emergent is race-based traumatic stress, right? This is any perceived race-related stress or trauma that is triggered by an external event that is memorable, comes as a surprise, it's outside of your control, and causes emotional pain. And so when you're thinking about microaggressions, right, or subtle acts of exclusion, because some folks really argue that microaggression minimizes the cumulative impact of these types of attacks, right? Because we know that it actually is resulting in stress and trauma that causes not only emotional pain, but also physiological degradation. And that's come from the research of Arlene Geronimus and her colleagues that really describe the long-term physical, emotional, mental, and psychological effects of racism and white supremacy. So one of the things that she and her colleagues found is that Black women actually have the highest allostatic load score, which is a measure of stress-related body chemicals and their cumulative effects on the body systems. And because weathering can be measured on a chromosomal level, studies have found that middle-aged Black women are actually on average, or appear on average, 7.5 years older than their white counterparts when you're examining chromosomes. And so you can think about what kind of effect that might have on things like maternal mortality outcomes, right? As many hopefully are aware, Black women in many places in the United States are 4 times more likely to die in childbirth, right? And so thinking about this cumulative impact of existing in racialized and gendered spaces, especially when we're not paying attention to that, either as individuals or as people in positions of power to shape workspaces or to shape community spaces in ways that is attentive and mindful to that, right? Racial battle fatigue is also another important concept. And this refers to the stress that comes from being a person of color in a predominantly white space. We know that the library profession, as well as the social work profession, is predominantly white, right? And we also know that when you are one of a few, that can lead to stress, which can have physiological consequences, right? When you are experiencing long-term exposure to the stress that comes from racism or sexism or other kinds of discrimination, this can lead to the decay of the cardiovascular, metabolic, and immune systems, which can make individuals more susceptible to early onset of chronic illnesses like diabetes, hypertension, morbid obesity, and even early death. And so I name this because weathering and racial battle fatigue are really important because they both can lead to physiological and psychological strain and stress. And when you are exposed to this over long periods of time, it can be so stressful, right, that it's really determining life or death. And so I name this because as part of my commitment as a social worker and as part of my commitment to racial equity and racial healing, it is to disrupt the impacts of race-based stress and trauma specifically, to work on interventions, to work on intervening, to not only minimize the impacts in real time, but to make sure that there are long-term solutions in place to make sure that we're not exposing individuals to situations or contexts that's going to lead to this, right? When we think about what it means to diversify our profession, right? What it means to bring in people to these spaces without also providing resources, it is actually, in my opinion, unethical in some ways because it can contribute to the degradation of their well-being, right? Of their physical well-being, of their mental well-being, of their emotional well-being. And so we need to be thinking about what supports can we put in place right now as well as long-term to make sure that we're thinking about this stress and we're not contributing to illness in our organization. And so when I think about accountability, right, because that then, if we know that, we know the different kinds of trauma that we're all experiencing, but that specifically when we think about individuals with racial identities that have been marginalized and historically oppressed, right, and that specific kind of trauma, that requires a certain level of accountability on the part of organizations, right? And I really love this definition that comes from Mackenzie Mack, that comes from the Audre Lorde's Transformative Justice Summit, I think in the early 2000s. But the definition is that accountability is about the work that we do to prevent, intervene, respond to, and heal from the harms caused by systems of oppression. And so I think that's really important, right? If accountability is about our relationship to harm, right, we're either contributing to harm or minimizing and helping heal from harm, right? I don't love binaries, but that is a binary that I do believe in. I think we need to be mindful of how we are centering those things, how we're preventing, intervening, responding to, and healing from the harms caused by systems of oppression. And this is something that I've thought about a lot for the last 7 years, at least. And that's because of what I think Dr. Sean Ginwright summarizes pretty succinctly. He came out with a book recently, The Fourth Pivots, Reimagining Justice and Reimagining Ourselves, that I think is just super, super brilliant and so important. But one of the things that I think is so important that his book has helped me understand, and his work and research that I've been able to be exposed to over the last few years, is that we're all facing so many challenges, right? But those challenges are going to require a significant shift in our values and in our ability to heal from the wounds of racism, of sexism, of poverty, right? And so on the screen is a quote that comes from Sean, Dr. Ginwright, and he is, like I said, a brilliant thinker around healing-centered practice, around radical healing, but he also does a lot of work around youth activism and youth development and supporting youth of color in healing, as well as educating youth of color as well. And I'll reference sort of 2 of his quotes from the book and also just highly recommend that you read it. But he says, healing involves more than repairing the deep wounds of racism, healing the scars of sexism, and easing the pains of poverty. Healing is a capacity to restore our humanity and care for ourselves and others, even in the midst of fear. Healing is the only pathway to real justice because it requires that we take an honest look at what harmed us and pushes us to restore our humanity and finally move more confidently into a possible future. And I think that's so important, right? Because it's begging this question, are we devolving or are we evolving in our collective capacity to engage in conflicting ideas, to engage in conflict itself, to heal, right? Because we can't wait until after we've sort of created new organizations or we've created new communities, created new societies to do that work. Hurt people show up in new systems and replicate that hurt, right? So it's something that needs to happen alongside all of the other work. So one of the things that also is named in his book is this quote. It says, eliminating things that harm us is not the same as creating things that heal us, right? We spend all of our time resisting and fighting and confronting, whether that's white supremacy, whether that's racism, patriarchy, right? Capitalism. We're challenging, we're doing all of these kind of violent things, but where are we cultivating? Cultivating healing, cultivating belonging, right? Inventing new systems, new ways of being and being in relation. All of the previous things, right? The fighting, the deconstructing, the confronting, those are violent sort of acts. But where is the healing? Because we've been bought into this idea that by removing barriers to inequality and by deeply analyzing policy, that's going to be enough to transform our society. And those things are important, right? But that's not enough, because removing barriers doesn't restore the harm and injury caused by oppression. So we have to transform ourselves as well, which means working on that self-transformation, working on that healing, working on that hopelessness, right? And that cultivating a vision of possibility. One of the descriptors that I sometimes use for myself right now is that I'm a radical Imagineer, right? I recognize the importance of possibility as a social justice tactic, right? And I think that a lot of organizations are attempting to really transform in some ways, or they're saying that they want to transform without really understanding what that requires. But they're trying to align around a commitment to equity, a commitment to social justice. But that can't happen if we're not healing, right? Like I said, we can't wait until after the changes happen to heal. And so we have to pivot. And the last quote I'll share from his book, again, please read the book, it's so good, is he talks about pivots. As defined by Dr. Ginwright, a pivot is a small change in direction from a single point where we are. It means that through one small change in direction over time, we can get to where we want to be. A pivot is not a complete abandonment of what we know, but it braids together what we know with how we feel and who we wish to be. So it's not a shift, right? Because a pivot, right, it's something that you do subtly. It's a subtle change in direction. That subtle change in direction over time has a profound impact. Have you ever sort of, it's like when you are moving your chair, well, maybe that's me, but when I'm sort of positioning my chair and I keep shifting it and suddenly all of a sudden I'm sort of on the other side of where I started, right? It's because over time you get to a completely different place, but it doesn't happen all at once. A shift takes a lot of effort. If I were to stand up right now and sort of turn around my chair, that takes more effort than just this gradual, like moving in that direction. It's subtle. And so a pivot is acknowledging that collective harm. It's also acknowledging individual harm and injury as well, right? But it's leaning into the future, right? It's this constant motion. That's why this presentation is titled Moving Towards Holistic Healing in Libraries, right? A pivot involves renewing our sense of possibility. It involves transforming how we see the world, and really shifting gradually our values and our culture. In his book, he talks about 4 pivots that he thinks are really important, and that he encourages people to make in order to really bring about systemic and long-term change. I'm not going to go into them now. But one of the questions I do have, and this is just a rhetorical question, you don't have to answer, but is what pivot do we need to make as individuals, as communities, and as a society? And how, right? Where are we currently and what direction are we trying to move towards? And how can we gradually make pivots in that direction? What is grounding us in that pivot? Right? I talk about connection and healing because what I am pivoting around, and I've been pivoting around for the last decade in terms of the work that I've been doing and why I'm committed to doing that work. And so that's where healing-centered practice comes in, right? We, in the last few years, maybe longer, because it's really started in social work, we started hearing more about trauma-informed practice or trauma-informed lens. And trauma-informed care really is understanding that individuals have been and often are exposed to trauma, right? And we need to be mindful about the ways in which that trauma could be manifesting so that we're not problematizing the individual, right? We're not saying what's wrong with you, right? We're asking what has happened to you, right? We're trying to better understand the individual in context so we can be more gracious in our interpretations of their actions, but so we're also making sure that our programs and our spaces and whatever we're providing is mindful of that as well, right? It's mindful of the trauma that people have been exposed to, that people might be carrying, and the ways in which that could be manifesting. And that's important, right? But I think it's also important to really think about, okay, we don't want to just focus on trauma, right? Right? We don't just want to focus on what we're sort of deconstructing or dismantling, right? What are we building in place? And that's where I think Dr. Ginwright's work really, really becomes so necessary. And so one necessary pivot that I think that we need to be making is towards being more healing centered, which moves as past being just trauma informed, right? Having that awareness of the impacts of trauma and the different kinds of trauma towards being healing centered, which is it's a holistic approach to healing that views trauma not simply as something that an individual experiences, right? But it highlights the ways in which trauma and healing are experienced collectively. And so when we're thinking about healing-centered engagement, we're thinking about how we can respond to trauma in ways that are more holistic, in ways that actually foster well-being, right? That being the goal, right? Our goal not being just to be trauma-informed, right? But to really center healing in all that we're doing. And we use the word practice, right? Because it's a choice. It's something that we're showing up to in the same way that we can practice a sport or practice a skill that we're trying to develop. We are practicing what it means to center this and all that we do because we know that historically that we haven't done that. And so this approach to our work invites us to acknowledge and realize that every choice we make, every interaction we have, every policy we create, all of it has the potential to either be re-traumatizing or healing for those that we're interacting with, right? And as a practice, it's something that we can commit to trying each day. And I find this really, really important because it really challenges the deficit sort of language and logic and practice that's typically sort of embedded in trauma-informed approaches and in traditional Western medicine, right? It invites me to challenge my own internalized Western logic, which assumes that trauma is just this individual experience and that it's not collective, right, or contextualized. Because when we're treating only one part of the individual, we're only really addressing one part of the equation. And so it's really important to think about how toxic systems, how toxic policies and practices impact individuals, right? And so that our change interventions are challenging those systems and creating new ones in their place. In terms of frameworks, another important framework that I think should help shape how individuals are understanding wellness, but how organizations are understanding wellness as well, is the 8 dimensions of wellness model that comes from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Service Administration. And so I'm not going to go too much into the different pieces, but what I really like about this is that this has a really expansive or holistic approach to understanding what shapes our well-being, right? It's emotional well-being, it's environmental well-being, right? Being able to be in a pleasant environment that is actually stimulating and supports your well-being, intellectual being, having access to resources and tools that can expand your skills and your knowledge. Physical well-being, right? That's when we think about our diet, our physical activity, our sleep, our nutrition. Occupational well-being, how much satisfaction we find in the work that we're doing, how valued we feel for the work that we do. Spiritual well-being, are we finding or do we have a sense of purpose in life? And that is that sense of purpose being nourished, right? Our social well-being, do we have connection? Do we have belonging? Do we have systems of support for ourselves? And then financial well-being, do we have access to the financial means to support our life, right? Are we satisfied with our current financial access, right? And so everyone is going to sort of require a different or distinct balance of these different dimensions to have their own internal sort of personal harmony, right? But lack of attention to any one area can negatively impact the other, right? If I'm not thinking about my financial well-being, that can lead to mental and emotional stress, right? It can lead to poor physical health, right? And so it's really important to think about how our wellness programs, whether that is our individual wellness programs or our organizational wellness programs, are thinking about these different aspects as well. And so I want to share some tips for engaging with wellness at both the individual level and at the sort of macro or meso level, which is the organizational level, because it's a both and sort of thing. And so I know that we talk about self-care, and self-care has really been reduced and sort of undervalued in a lot of ways, but I think about self-care as doing whatever you need to return to your as balanced of a state that you can be, right? Creating those rituals for persistence and resistance. And that is so important for all of us existing in experiencing collective trauma, but also for those of us with identities, like I said, that have historically been marginalized and oppressed. And so when we're thinking about this, we're thinking about, okay, what are things that I can do to tend to my emotional well-being, my physical well-being, my mental well-being, my spiritual well-being, my intellectual well-being, and how can I create plans for that so that it is easier for me to access decisions that are actually supporting myself? Because I think that when we're in periods of stress, we regress to what we know or what is easiest for us to do. And oftentimes, because we haven't spent the time to really think about like what serves us, what fills us, right? We often choose sort of instinctually things that deplete us, things that don't actually support our well-being. And so by creating a plan, by ritualizing our self-care behavior, it makes it easier to access those things. And so an example of a plan, right? You can do this on Word, you can do this on your phone, there's different apps. Thinking about the different dimensions, physical self-care. Okay, if that's the different practices that I can engage in to maintain my overall well-being, what does that look like? Okay, taking 10,000 steps a day. What is an accountability strategy so that I can measure whether or not I'm engaging in that, right? I have an Apple Watch or a Fitbit, and I'm tracking my steps through that, right? I get reminders throughout the day to take a walk or something. If I make a goal to get 6.5 hours of sleep, I can download an app like Auto Sleep that tells me each day how I'm doing, how restless I was throughout my night, et cetera, et cetera. I'm not going to go into each of these examples, but I'll do another one. If the dimension of self-care that you're trying to prioritize or improve or tend to is professional self-care, how are you avoiding burnout? How are you maintaining a healthy work-life balance? What does it look like to take time off work and to proactively set that, right? I knew when I was working full-time at the library that each quarter I needed at least 2 days, right, to tend to myself. And so at the beginning of the quarter, I looked at what period would be the least stressful in terms of the different things that I was juggling, and I proactively scheduled that time. I also made a point to have a lunch buddy, right? Someone who I knew was also struggling with making sure that they were taking lunch breaks. And so our alarm would go off, we would take that lunch break together, right? Those are ways to hold ourselves accountable. My manager knew that I needed to take those 2 days each quarter. And if it was approaching towards the end of the quarter and I hadn't taken them, I had ways to be reminded of that. And so really thinking about how you can proactively create goals, but then also ways to make sure that you're actually engaging in that activity. Another way that I sort of ritualize self-care is I've got a collection of Post-its that hang on my door for things that feel like self-care for me in alignment with the different dimensions of self-care. So if I'm thinking about intellectual self-care, reading a really juicy podcast or reading a book that is really specialized in a subject that I am studying or wanting to include into my professional life, that feels like self-care for me. Jump roping feels like self-care for me and is fun, right? It's tending to my physical well-being, but also it feels like play. And it's also broken down in terms of how long it takes. So this, in my more evolved version of this is an older demonstration. I have it color coded, where my green Post-it notes are activities that take 15 minutes. My pink ones are activities that take 30 minutes. And then my yellow are the activities that take 60 minutes. And so if I am feeling sort of out of sorts, right, if I check in and I know that I need to do something, I can check in and see what part of me needs tending to, but then I also can have easy access to reminders of things that will help fill me up, right? And then I have a tracker sectioned out into the different sort of domains of self-care, right? Relational, physical, mental. And so if I do an activity that is in response to one of those or supports one of those dimensions, I'll put a post-it note there. And so at the end of the week, I can see, okay, these are all of the ways that I took care of myself. And oh, I really did a good job here tending to my physical self, but my relational self really might be hurting, right? And so I can proactively then think about how I might then go on a friend date the following week or do something that will fill me up in those ways. So really thinking about what you need and what will feel supportive for you. Again, to be clear, we can't self-care our way out of systemic shortcomings, right? These are a both and sort of set of recommendations. So we can play a role in maintaining our own well-being. We also need agency, we need time, we need space and resources to do so. And it's up to leadership to make that choice as available as possible, right? Normalizing that in organizations. That has to happen in order for us to be able to choose to take care of ourselves, right? In order for us to collectively create that space so that we're not individually tending to ourselves, right? But we're tending to the collective, tending to the community. And so when we're thinking about the different elements of organizational well-being, there's sort of 5 dimensions. So there's the career well-being. This is that people in their work, they like what they do every day. Social well-being, they have relationships with the people that they're doing that work with, right? Financial well-being, they make wages that provide financial security. Physical well-being, they have enough energy, right? They have breaks and spaces to take those breaks. And then community well-being, that they're attached to and engaged in their community, that their organization doesn't exist outside of their community. And these are the elements that really shape an employee's overall well-being within an organization, right? That really shape how well an organization is doing, right? Which then has implications for how well it can be serving its community. And so when we're thinking about wellness programs, I think it's really important to think about it in this kind of way. It's not just creating access to apps, right? If an individual isn't financially well, it doesn't matter what meditations they have access to, right? If they don't feel happy in their job, it doesn't matter how much they like the people that they're working with. And so all of these need to interact in order for an employee to be well within their organization. And so some catalysts for organizational well-being. Do your development plans include well-being goals? Is it incentivized for folks to even prioritize their well-being, right? Do we normalize and share and celebrate when individuals are making decisions or doing things to prioritize their well-being? How are we communicating in ways that are not frenzied, right? In ways that are empathetic, in ways that are prioritizing well-being? Are folks incentivized to or inspired to participate in activities that produce those results? Do the rules and guidelines surrounding access to well-being, do they actually work for or interfere with the folks' access to well-being? Is it easy to even move around the office or to see outside, right? Is the building space well lit? All of these things that can be catalysts to well-being. I really love the slide that comes from Gallup. They do a survey every year looking at workplace trends. And US workers are some of the most stressed employees in the world. And so they were surveying to see some of the things that organizations were doing, because the pandemic was really an opportunity, I think, for us to really it forced us to understand the ways in which we needed to prioritize well-being. And so different strategies that different interventions that organizations were employing during the pandemic that aligned with those 5 well-being elements. So for instance, when you're thinking about financial well-being, right? And the different policies that existed, providing childcare support or providing access to loan repayment, right? When you're thinking about community well-being, thinking about the ways in which we're celebrating individuals who are going above and beyond to support and show up for community, right? That being an example of both community and recognition. And so thinking about the ways in which we're embedding wellness into all aspects of our organization, not only into the policies, right? But the spaces, the development goals, the incentives, the ways in which we're planning or incentivizing, et cetera. The last thing that I'll share is sort of a tangible example of how an organization sort of might pivot around commitment to being healing centered, right? But also to promoting organizational well-being. And so when I was working at DPL, I supported the creation of this wellness model, this culturally responsive wellness model. And it was based on findings from research that I had done, as well as research that we worked with the consultant to do, to really think about how we were fostering those sort of 5 dimensions of well-being as organizational well-being, as well as the 8 dimensions of wellness. And we had sort of 3 overarching priorities, in addition to all of the other strategic EDI work that we were doing that were more related to like wages, et cetera. So really thinking about the wellness resources that staff had access to, making sure that staff had access to resources to actually meet their wellness needs, thinking about mental health education. How are we providing ongoing learning opportunities to build skills in specific areas, as well as social support? How are we fostering relationships to have that social connection, right? We're thinking about the different ways in which we can sort of go about shifting a culture, pivoting a culture, right? We want it to be really, really, really thoughtful and holistic. When we're talking about culturally responsive, we're really understanding that culture is central to how we move through the world, and that this type of model really has to center communities and folks who have been historically decentered and marginalized, right? By tending to those who have been hurt the most, right, we heal the whole. And so a culturally responsive model is one that is intentionally designed to meet the needs of the individual, but to also promote the collective well-being of the whole. And it responds to the ways in which social and political events may have had differing impacts on the individuals, as well as may currently be impacting individuals. So it's disrupting those patterns and those systems of inequity that are negatively impacting one's well-being, and creating new systems that promote well-being and that promote healing. And so that model was a way for us to try out different interventions in alignment with those 3 overarching goals of focusing on increasing social connection, on making sure that we are providing mental health education and increasing access to resources, so that we had sort of these guideposts really to understand what was needed for our staff. And that also, like I said, came from feedback from our staff, as well as the research that I was conducting around looking at how we're holistically and thoughtfully shaping and thinking about well-being. And so examples of wellness resources, providing access to this app. We piloted quarterly wellness hours. And so staff had access to 8 hours of wellness leave a quarter to do whatever they saw fit in alignment with the 8 dimensions of well-being. I actually received word today that has now been made permanent as part of DPL's processes, which is a really exciting thing. I remember when it was just an idea to be like, what if we paid people to take care of themselves in addition to providing them with resources to do so. And now it's reality, right? And so that's a really exciting win. We provided staff with access to an on-call mental health support provider, and we provided increased access to wellness classes. Mental health education, providing access to healing-centered training, making sure that supervisors and managers were undergoing ongoing training, increasing information around the employee assistance program, providing mental health first aid, as well as establishing peer supports. And then social supports, providing monthly racial healing circles for BIPOC staff, offering monthly racial healing circles for staff, creating affinity groups, integrating mindful moments into meetings. These are some of the things that we were doing to mitigate the harm, the trauma, right, in real time, and to promote healing in real time while working on these long-term systemic changes, right? Looking at salary and discrepancies by identity, for instance, right? Thinking about microaggressions and disciplinary outcome and how that was playing out, right? That it was a both and, not just the resources, but also making sure that we're thinking long-term. And so in closing, it's up to all of us as individuals, right, to check in on ourselves, to determine and communicate our needs, to take advantage of the tools that we have access to. So interpersonally, it's up to us to model healthy wellness behaviors, to encourage our colleagues to do the same. And then when we're thinking organizationally on that macro level, right, it's up to leadership to create and maintain a culture that prioritizes well-being by changing systems, by changing policies, right, by examining the things that really become barriers to well-being, and then creating new policies, new processes that facilitate that.